The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. Over the 27 years since the Delgamuukw decision, the relationship between First Nations and the Government of Canada has changed, in some ways significantly, in others not so much, says Bruce McIver, the author of Indigenous Rights in 1 Minute. The legal relationship took another step forward following the Haida decision in 2004. That decision led to changes in the way resource and infrastructure projects are approved and built. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was another milestone, first as a healing journey and second in establishing a record of Indigenous history in Canada. The TRC recorded the mistreatment and trampling of rights of First Nations people and shared those stories with the entire country. The Commission heard testimony from 6,500 witnesses, which culminated in a call to 94 actions to further facilitate reconciliation. Understanding and appreciating the unique legal and societal circumstances Indigenous people lived under and endured for more than 150 years is challenging. Bruce McIver says a big part of reconciliation is calling out misinformation and lies, getting to the truth so that we can have honest conversations. He says that was his motivation to write the book. I invited Bruce McIver to join me for a conversation that matters about what we all need to know in order to talk about reconciliation. Welcome, Bruce.
Hi, thanks for inviting me on.
I'm going to start with a simple question. It's one that I asked Senator Murray Sinclair in a previous conversation. What to you does reconciliation actually look like?
Reconciliation in this context now is moving actually beyond duty to consult type of obligations, moving to recognizing Indigenous laws and moving towards a consent-based relationship with Indigenous people.
How close do you think we are to getting there?
It really varies across the country where you are. I do this work coast to coast to coast, and it's important. A lot of the relationships that Indigenous people have are with provincial governments. And that can be quite variable depending where you are. And then it can also change depending on whether, to put it bluntly, Indigenous people are sitting on a gold mine.
Yes.
If they have something non-Indigenous people want, it's much more likely you will see proponents, federal, provincial government come to the table and ask, what is it going to take to get your consent? If they're not sitting on that gold mine, if they're opposed to whatever the proposed development might be, that's much less likely.
Mm-hmm. It's also interesting looking in Canada. Of course, we have different jurisdictions that were established under different rules of law. You know, let's take a look at New Brunswick, for example. It was first settled by the French, and French law set the framework by which, New Brunswick moved ultimately into Confederation. Well, that's different than the way in which British Columbia joined a confederation. It's different than Alberta, which was part of Rupert's Land long before there was the initial part of Confederation. Mm-hmm. So it becomes very challenging to understand how we apply what we understand or what need to be the rights of Indigenous people to be able to get the proper legal outcomes.
A lot of this depends on history. My colleague Kate Gunn and I teach a course every year at UBC Law School on Aboriginal rights and title. And I think a lot of the students are surprised how much of it is historical, geographical, explaining where are you and when are you. Because it's very different, as you say, Canada's colonization project took place in a different time with different factors on the East Coast. So the treaties entered into with the Mi'kmaq in the 1760s, very different from the context in BC when you had Governor Douglas entering into treaties, at least with some Indigenous peoples, in the 1850s.
Yeah.
So the time frame is very, very different. The factors at play. And really importantly, the Indigenous people themselves are so different. It's important for non-Indigenous people to get away from this generalization, Indigenous. There are distinct Indigenous nations, peoples with their own laws, history, cultures, relationships with the Crown. And you really do need to do some of the work, and it's good work. It's interesting work to understand those complexities.
As you're saying that, you remind me of something that Ellis Ross said to me in a conversation that I had with him. He says, you know, occasionally I'll get somebody saying to me, well, you're Haisla. How come you don't agree with those people who are Haida? And he goes, well, you're white. How come you don't agree with the Premier of Alberta?
Exactly.
It's like, it's the same thing.
They have their own histories. I like to speak to my clients about historically, how would they do what we call now alternative dispute resolution? And the different examples I will hear from across the country, how they would enter into and try to resolve conflicts or disagreements with their Indigenous neighbors, really underscores, one, that long history, that deep history of Indigenous law that's embedded in the land, and the complexities and the ways that Indigenous people find a way to resolve these things. They don't need colonizer law to resolve this. They've been resolving these things for thousands of years in this place. It didn't start with Captain Cook sailing into Nootka Sound. That history and law is so incredibly deep. And if we can work towards tapping into that, supporting Indigenous people to revitalize that, that's a much better way forward than trying to force Indigenous people to just accept Canadian law.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. In a conversation that I had with Chief Joe Alphonse of the Silkatine, he said, look, we're not going anywhere, and neither is anybody else. It's incumbent upon us to work this out. Because I've had so many interesting conversations about this, when Perry Bellegarde was the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, I had him in for a conversation, and he said, it's not a straight line. At times it will be messy, but as long as there's a willingness to understand and move forward based on knowing the truth, we can figure this out. And he said at times it will be very messy, and I believe that's true. And you said that you wrote this book so that people can get closer to the truth.
Yeah, I think it's really important because there's a lot of misinformation out there. I don't think there are some individuals, it doesn't matter what you try to do to engage in a respectful conversation, they don't want to do that. But those people are pretty rare. I do this work all across the country. I've done workshops for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people all across the country. And I think in general, there's a interest in having this conversation. And there's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of misinformation. Some politicians take advantage of that. But I think in general, the average Canadian, they want to have that conversation, but they need reliable information to have it. And one of my motivations in writing the book is that I think the law is explainable to everyone. I think the first line in my book is, this book is not for lawyers. This book is for I'm sure a lot of lawyers will buy it, but it's for non-lawyers who want to engage in a meaningful way in this conversation, whether it's in public or just around the kitchen table with their family and friends. I think if we want to move towards reconciliation, we need to have better conversations with our families and friends.
So let's go way back. Let's go back to the Doctrine of Discovery, 1492-ish, somewhere around there. A papal bull is issued to settle a dispute between Spain and Portugal. And the Pope says, well, if you can demonstrate that you were the first European country there, you planted a flag, buried some coins or whatnot, then that land is yours, and everything that's in it, including the peoples there. Like, it was actually quite a brutal law that said, if there are people there, they don't matter. You've got two choices. You can either convert them to Christianity or you can kill them off. Like, it's like that was the basis of it. And so therefore you had the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, and even the British all kind of operating under that same principle. And when the British and French first showed up in Canada, I mean, that was basically accepted as, yeah, we have the right to do this.
Yeah, we see that today in the news today. People are learning a little bit more about the history of the Hudson Bay Company. Well, the Hudson Bay Company was founded in 1670 by a king simply going, you know what, I'm going to issue a charter. Here it is. I'm going to give you the right to all this territory that flows into Hudson Bay. That's a prime example of the doctrine of discovery at work. These are indigenous lands. The idea that the Crown can simply sign a document and then an interest changes to these capitalists in London that want to develop a fur trade, that is the basis. That's a prime example of what Canada as a nation state is based on. And it's not historical. This is something that we deal with every day. And it's one of the things I hope I get across with the book, is that colonization isn't something just about the past. It's going on today, every day. And we're all involved in it, whether we know it or not. It happens. We're there. We're part of it. And at least recognize it and then start to think about, you know, is this something I'm comfortable with? Is it something that I need to at least do my best to see that there are real changes?
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. Where I get confused is I go, okay, I believe that the court in London went, okay, maybe that's not going to hold up. Doctrine of discovery. So they issue the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which basically orders in all of their colonies around the world, you have to go out and negotiate treaties and have the land officially ceded to the Crown. But it's kind of like going in after you've already taken what's there and saying, now I just want you to rubber stamp that. Does that confuse our understanding? Because there's a lot of people who go, well, no, there's been treaties signed, there's been ceding of land in certain areas, but not everywhere. Because you get a lot of people who go, no, it's the right of the Canadian government.
Yeah. Well, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 is a good example of a double-edged sword. Because Indigenous people, a lot of Indigenous people look to it as a recognition by the Crown that they do have an existing interest in the land. At the same time, it was also an expression of the doctrine of discovery. Because what the Crown is saying is that we are now sovereign. We can do this proclamation. And yes, there may be local rights, and there's a huge conversation in the law afterwards, what those rights might be. Still, underlying it all now is the effect of planting that flag or signing that document that we've usurped Indigenous laws. We've usurped them. We've usurped Indigenous sovereignty. Now it's all reliant on the Crown. So the Royal Proclamation, while there's positives to it, I think, and I explain this in the book, it's important to step back and see what it's a part of, this larger colonization project in Canada that continues to the present day.
Well, I think it becomes even more confusing in British Columbia because at the time that British Columbia was now negotiating to become part of Canada, one of the agreed upon actions between Canada and the governor of British Columbia was that you would go out and you would negotiate treaties with 108 nations in British Columbia. And they got started and then went, forget it, and didn't do it. But then they lied to the government of Canada saying that they had.
Yeah.
And so it gets really messy.
There's been a lot written about this. Great BC historians have written about what occurred with Douglas and then on to Trutch and Malcolm Sprout. And it's fascinating history. It's important to understand it as part of a rejection of Indigenous interest in the land. That's where they moved to. At first, Governor Douglas is saying, well, we do have to deal with these Indigenous people. One of the things that he was very alive to at the time is that they outnumber the white people.
Significantly.
Significantly. So, they are a real threat. And so we've got to come to the table and negotiate what you think of the Douglas treaties and how they've been disrespected over the years is an ongoing issue. But then, as you say, that treaty negotiation policy was abandoned. And we don't get it coming back in a different form. Not totally different. I can talk about that. Post-Calder decision in 1973.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. We could spend hours talking about land rights, but let's also talk about individual rights and those of Indigenous-led companies. I think most non-Indigenous Canadians don't realize that under the Indian Act, an Indigenous person or a community cannot put up their property as collateral to borrow money to have access to capital. And so, people are saying, well, get a job, do this, do that. Yeah, if we were all living on with the same set of rules, maybe, but we're not living with the same set of rules.
Yeah, it's really important for people to understand there are Indigenous lands, so that's their Indigenous people's wider territory. And then there are these small little pieces which are reserve lands.
Right.
And they have a different legal standing. So when we're talking about Indigenous land, we're not just talking about reserves. That's the first point. There's the Crown land, which is most of BC. That's Indigenous land. We call it Crown land, but in BC, in the Supreme Court has been clear, most of BC at least, there's no legal entitlement that the Crown has to those lands.
Right. Silcotin laid that out a bit, didn't it? It said from mountaintop to mountaintop, you can demonstrate that you were here.
Right.
That's your territory.
Well, and 10 years before, in the Haida decision in 2004, the Supreme Court famously referred to so-called Crown interest, Crown land in BC as de facto control, which means that the provincial government is controlling it as a matter of fact, but not as a matter of law, because they've never made treaties for those lands. So that's all Indigenous land. And then we have these small, and particularly in BC, most of BC, very small reserves, and that comes out of the policy changes that you referred to when BC entered Confederation.
Right. And a lot of that was, okay, this may have been your traditional territory. Well, that's the worst part of your traditional territory. That's where your band can reside.
Right. That or, we're going to reserve a fishing spot. So you have these very small reserves on the Fraser.
Right.
Basically a rock for Indigenous people to fish from. That's all, and that's your reserve land. So the state of reserve land, it's important, as you say, for people to realize the title to that land is actually in the Crown.
Yeah.
Canada owns that land, and it's there for the use and benefit of Indian Act bands. And I try to explain this in the book, the different categories of Indigenous nations, First Nations, the different categories of Indigenous people. It's very, very complicated. I try to set it out as clearly as possible, but for non-Indigenous people, if they're going to try to have a serious conversation about this, it helps if they try to understand what these different categories are.
So things continue to change. I mean, we entered into the treaty making process a little bit under the government of Gordon Campbell. But in talking to a number of Indigenous leaders these days, I hear them say, we don't care about the treaty process any longer. We're going a legal route, and we believe that we don't even have to worry about that any longer, that it's recognized. From your perspective, where are we at? Yeah,
there's a real change in BC. The big steps were, like you say, in 1973 with the Calder decision from the Supreme Court, which basically was, you know what, Aboriginal title is actually a thing.
It exists.
We're not saying where it might exist, but it could exist out there. So we have that in 73, and then that leads to a change of federal government policy under the Trudeau government to start.
Trudeau the senior,
Trudeau the first to negotiate treaties. Supposedly he said, it looks like you might have more rights than we thought you did. So that changes post-Calder in 73. Then you have a big change in 97 in BC with the Delgamuukw decision. Because with the Delgamuukw decision, the court says, you know what? Yes, there is this thing called Aboriginal title, and this is what it means. What it means, because there was an argument, it's just the right to do things on the land. That was what the provincial government said. It's just hunting, fishing, you just bundle them all. And the court said, no, it's not. It's actually a right to the land itself. And that's huge. It's not exactly fee simple interest, but it's a right to the land itself. And importantly, it's a right to make decisions about your land. So that is a huge change. Where I think things are going now, which you'll see in BC, is that more and more Indigenous nations are saying, we reject the treaty process. Because that's really at the base of it, substituting our existing rights for rights that are delimited in this document. We're not doing that for all kinds of reasons. What we want is to move beyond denial of the rights to recognition and implementation of those rights, not through a treaty, but through an agreement. So the most obvious example of that change was the Haida.
The Haida decision in 2004.
The Haida agreement last year to recognize the Aboriginal title. That is where things are going in BC. Recognition and implementation, not necessarily, you don't have to go to court. You don't got to go to court to do it. Government can just recognize it and get on with that hard work, but it doesn't have to be as a treaty under the current comprehensive claims policy, which a lot of Indigenous people are turning their backs on.
Well, I thank you for writing this book, and if anybody wants to start to get a better understanding of the legal framework under which First Nations and Indigenous people live in Canada, I recommend it's a good read. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.